I was studying in the library one day, scrolling on Instagram as students sometimes do when we study, when my mom randomly sent me an Instagram reel. The video opened with a panoramic shot of an eagle soaring above a mountain range. There was a crow perched on top of the eagle, desperately holding on as the eagle soared higher and higher into the sky. Eventually, the crow fell off. A deep, solemn voice said, "Be like the eagle. When life places a crow on your back, continue to flap your wings and the crow will fall off." She sent this video to motivate me, I think. The crow represented hardship and my ideal self, the eagle. I couldn't help but wonder, though, how applicable is this? I mean, I know that I am not a bird, but what happens when life places a massive boulder on my back instead of a crow? What happens when my wings are torn off? How then can I continue to fly? I think this moment illustrates some of the questions that many of us have about our lives. How do we overcome difficulty? How do we move past our traumatic experiences? How exactly can we fall forward? I think it's safe to say that we are living in an increasingly traumatic and traumatized world. Since the 1960s, the usage of the word trauma has increased exponentially. I have heard of relationships ending because of too much trauma dumping, and other relationships being formed through trauma bonding. During the COVID-19 pandemic, my social media pages were flooded with people describing this period as traumatic. Here's an example of a Twitter post by CNBC in which researchers warn us how the pandemic can inflict emotional trauma and PTSD on an unprecedented scale. In January of this year, I even saw a news article titled, "The Internet is Trauma Dumping on Elmo." Poor Elmo. So I think it's safe to say that trauma is becoming a part of our everyday discourse, at least in the United States. But what exactly is trauma? Gabor Mate, a physician and expert in trauma and stress, defines trauma as an invisible force that shapes our lives. It shapes the way we live, the way we love, and the way we make sense of the world. It is the root of our deepest wounds. Bessel van der Kolk, a Dutch psychiatrist and the author of The Body Keeps the Score, defines trauma as an event that overwhelms the central nervous system, altering the way we process and recall memories. Judith Herman, another psychiatrist who published the book Trauma and Recovery, defines trauma as an affiliation of the powerless. At the moment of trauma, the victim is rendered helpless by overwhelming force. These definitions, made by prominent leaders in the field, effectively capture a sense of ambiguity in the meaning of the word and the experience. From these definitions, we can discern that trauma enacts devastating consequences on our bodies, our social relationships, our cognitive functioning, and our societies, just to name a few. What is less clear is which experiences cross the threshold into being trauma, and why has trauma become so prevalent now? I set out to answer this question in the summer of 2023 when I received the Circumnavigator travel grant. This allowed me to travel to 5 international locations and conduct an independent research project. My research involved in-depth, semi-formal interviews with experts in the fields of trauma care and research in each of these locations. Today, I would like to share my learnings from 4 of these countries: Argentina, Northern Ireland, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and South Korea. In Buenos Aires, I had the opportunity to speak with the director and co-founder of the Argentine Society of Psychotrauma, ED. This society organizes international mental health conferences, offers courses to promote trauma education, and publishes a journal in Spanish devoted to psychological trauma. From 1976 to 1983, Argentina suffered a period of violence with a military dictatorship, during which 30,000 people were killed, and many were subjected to torture and imprisonment without trial. I asked Ed, "Have you seen the effects of this history on the landscape of trauma in your country?" He responded that he hasn't, despite his many years of practice. Even though he was a direct victim of the dictatorship himself, he did not personally conceptualize this moment as a traumatic event in his life. Instead, he said he sees cases of trauma most frequently caused by childhood sexual abuse, robberies, and motor vehicle accidents. The separation of Argentina's political history with their cases of trauma was echoed in my conversation with a psychologist at Fundación Aigle. Fundación Aigle is a foundation dedicated to promoting mental health education and providing therapy for the local population. The foundation was established as a response to the oppression of the military dictatorship. But despite being created in its aftermath, my interviewee, Claudia, said that she sees cases of trauma due to sexual violence or other forms of violence rather than the country's history. Both Ed and Claudia also had interesting approaches to treating trauma patients. Ed characterized the different therapeutic approaches and techniques he uses as a toolbox. Depending on the needs and interests of his clients, he selects certain tools, such as eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and hypnosis. On the other hand, Claudia's treatment can be divided into two phases. In the first phase, she focuses on the memory of the trauma and reducing PTSD symptoms. The most important aspect of this phase is reframing the trauma experience. She tells her patients that their responses to trauma are natural and necessary for their survival. And by doing this, she changes their narrative from that of a victim to that of a survivor. In the second phase, she helps her patient to be happier and more functional in their lives. Her goal in therapy is not to reconstruct, but to repair. Next, I traveled to Belfast, Northern Ireland. Similar to Argentina, Northern Ireland is a post-conflict country. The nation endured 30 years of civil conflict and unrest, known as the Troubles. During this time, many people were killed, and in 1998, the Good Friday Agreement marked a theoretical end to the violence, but since then, paramilitary groups from both sides have continued to engage in acts of terrorism across the country. My interviewees emphasize that trauma in Northern Ireland is profoundly shaped by this historical background. This directly contrasts with the perspectives of my interviewees in Argentina, who saw cases of trauma stemming from incidents of violence rather than the nation's history. In Belfast, I spoke to several members of the Regional Trauma Network, or the RTN. The RTN is associated with the Department of Health and spans across the entire country, providing psychological services to local populations. Magda, one of the therapists I spoke to from the Northern Trust, says most of her cases involve clients who have witnessed shootings, dead bodies, explosions, or threats from the police or paramilitary groups. But she also sees cases of trauma stemming from bullying, burnout, and parental neglect. Many of her patients have incurred multiple traumatic incidents throughout their lives, so their traumas from different origins have compounded over time. Several different therapeutic approaches were also used among my interviewees. For example, Stephen, another psychotherapist I spoke to, primarily uses the Ehlers and Clark model of PTSD in his practice. This framework approaches PTSD from a cognitive perspective. Stephen emphasized that he uses this model to transform the meaning of trauma for his clients. His goal in his therapy is not to figure out what exactly happened during the traumatic incident, but to uncover the root feeling associated with that incident. That root feeling, such as shame or guilt, is what is causing the suffering. He also uses unconventional approaches beyond the typical therapy setting and structure. For example, he once took a group of his clients to a local comedy club. They incorporated their diagnoses and painful experiences into a script and then performed them in front of each other. Surprisingly, this promoted healing and a sense of community among his clients. Despite being more than 1,000 miles away from each other, Magda's therapeutic approach incorporated a reframing of trauma that was similar to that of Claudia's. For example, many of Magda's patients come to her with a diagnosis, but she explained that part of her responsibility as a therapist is to help her client unlearn that label. Magda's treatment can be divided into 3 phases. In the first phase, she focuses on destigmatizing therapy and stabilizing the patient. In the second phase, she helps the patient to process their traumatic memories and understand trauma in a healthy way. In the third phase, she supports her patient to rebuild their independence and become reconnected with the self and the larger society. This objective of therapy to promote a sense of community and reconnection aligns with the conceptualization of trauma held by Maria, a therapist in the Belfast Trust. Maria said, trauma has a narcissistic quality to it. It traps people inside of themselves and normalizes their isolation. If you do not help people to manage their trauma, the trauma will manage them and the entire course of their lives. She also takes a picture of each of her clients at both the first and the last sessions. She does this because their healing is visible after receiving therapy. In their final pictures, her clients are lighter because they are reconnected to their activities and their societies. So, it's not just trauma that causes a ripple effect in communities, it's also healing. I'd like to conclude my findings from Northern Ireland with a quote provided by Magda. "Trauma does not need to break us. It is just a part of our lifelong journey." Next, I went to Bosnia-Herzegovina. Similar to Northern Ireland, all of my interviewees in Bosnia emphasized the prevalence of war trauma in their practice. Even younger generations experienced transgenerational trauma as the consequences of the war permeated deep into Bosnian societies and families. Bosnia suffered a horrific war between 1992 and 1995 that was characterized by massive destruction, ethnic cleansing, rape, and genocide. Many members of the population developed symptoms of PTSD that prevailed in the decades following the end of this conflict. At the beginning of the war, psychological and therapeutic knowledge of PTSD was limited, but by the end of the war, various psychosocial programs were organized to treat trauma victims. In Bosnia, I spoke to psychotherapists at Wings of Hope, one such psychosocial support NGO based in Sarajevo. My interviews in Bosnia predominantly focused on treatments to trauma. Tea, one of the psychotherapists I spoke to at Wings, uses both the integrative model and cognitive behavioral therapy in her practice. However, beyond the specific technique, she emphasized that the most important element in therapy is contact. Effective therapy focuses on the contact between the client and the therapist to foster healing. Tea said, in the same way, trauma is also about contact. If someone that you depended on did not fulfill your needs, that is trauma. Sinisa, another psychotherapist I spoke to at Wings, primarily uses Gestalt therapy in his practice. With this approach, he strives to look at the big picture and doesn't limit his therapeutic scope to just one aspect of the client. For this reason, he avoids diagnosing his clients, because a diagnosis can put the client into a box. The label can shape and limit one's self-perception. This might be why Magda in Northern Ireland also helps her clients to unlearn their diagnoses. Sinisa emphasized that the turning point in his therapy is the moment when his clients become self-aware. Trauma is not an entity that can be resolved alone. By successfully identifying their traumas and its manifestations, his clients are empowered to continue asking for help when they are in pain. He also identified an interesting dichotomy between trauma as a lived experience and trauma as a psychological condition. Many people characterize their experiences as traumatic, but they insist that they are not traumatized. Finally, I want to share an interview from South Korea with a psychiatrist at the Yonsei University College of Medicine. Towards the beginning of our conversation, my interviewee made a very strong statement that trauma is at the core of psychiatric and psychological care. But towards the end of our interview, he said, "Not all of my patients have trauma." I said, "How can trauma be the core of psychiatry if not all of your patients have it?" In response, he gave two different definitions of trauma. The first one is founded on experience, and the second on the diagnosis of PTSD. Every single one of his cases revolves around this first kind of trauma, but not all experiences of trauma cause PTSD and can manifest in different ways. This distinction is important because most of my interviewees talked about this more general trauma rather than specifically PTSD. Suh said that he has found power in identifying trauma. Reframing mental disorders and symptoms as products of traumatic experiences helps clinicians to overcome their stigmas and patients to experience a transformation of their self-perceptions. Their problems did not arise from their inherent faults, but from their traumas. So in summary, many different therapeutic approaches were used both within and across my research locations, such as EMDR, hypnosis, Gestalt therapy, and the Ehlers and Clark model. My interviewees in Bosnia and Northern Ireland emphasized how their landscapes of trauma are profoundly shaped by their historical backgrounds. But my interviewees in Argentina did not share this perspective. Many different types of trauma were also identified throughout my research. For example, cases of trauma emerged from war, from violence, from bullying, and from damaged social attachments. To be honest, I felt a bit stuck after completing my interviews because I felt like I came out of the experience with more questions than concrete answers. If this was how I understood trauma before my research project, then this was how I understood it after. All of my interviewees used different therapeutic approaches and gave various definitions of trauma. So I can't tell you, if you have trauma, go receive this specific modality of therapy. And I can't tell you, if you have trauma, do X, Y, and then Z. In fact, I came to a pretty daunting and anticlimactic conclusion. There just are no clear-cut answers. Thank you. I'm just kidding, that would be a pretty bleak way to end. I'm not quite done. Even though I came out of this experience without finding any concrete answers, I felt strangely hopeful. Sure, there is no one-size-fits-all answer to recovering from trauma, but that doesn't mean that there are no answers, or that finding those answers and finding healing is impossible. Towards the beginning of this talk, I asked, which experiences cross the threshold into being trauma? I think the answer to this question is for each and every one of us to decide. Trauma is profoundly mediated by its context. The same incident can be traumatic for one person and not for another. You do not need someone to validate that you have suffered. Many of my interviewees focused on reframing experiences as traumatic and understanding symptoms as natural responses. By reframing our painful experiences as traumatic, we can extend greater compassion to ourselves and to others. And by understanding our symptoms, not as an inherent part of who we are, but as products of the difficulties that we have faced, we can actively and responsibly begin to construct a path to recovery. Trauma is becoming more and more an inevitable part of being human in today's world. By using the transformative power of trauma, we can practice greater patience with ourselves and be emboldened to ask for help when we are struggling. I hope that by taking this first step, we can all begin the process of falling forward. Thank you, for real this time.